but of course, a female. How long that lasted, he didn't know. At the appropriate time, the gong rang out. But, as Hans Castorp was aware, it was not the call for dinner itself, merely the warning to get ready for it. And so he lay there a while, until the metallic rumble swelled and fell away a second time. When Joachim came through the room to fetch him, Hans Castorp wanted to change first, but Joachim said it was too late and wouldn't let him. He hated unpunctuality. How could you ever make any progress and become healthy enough for military service again, he said, if you were so weak-willed that you couldn't make it to meals on time? He was right, of course, and Hans Castorp could only point out that he wasn't the one who was sick, although he certainly was incredibly sleepy. He just washed his hands quickly, and they walked down to the dining hall for the third time. The guests were streaming in through both entrances. Some were even coming through the veranda doors that stood open opposite, and soon they were all sitting around the 7 tables as if they had never left them. That, at least, was Hans Castorp's impression, a purely dreamy, irrational impression, of course, which he could not get out of his befuddled brain for the moment, and which even gave him a certain pleasure. Such pleasure, in fact, that he tried to recapture it several times during the course of the meal, and indeed was able to recreate the illusion perfectly. The chipper old lady was once again keeping up a steady stream of blurry Russian directed diagonally toward Dr. Blumenkohl, who listened with a careworn face. Her skinny grandniece finally ate something other than yogurt, the gooey cream of barley soup that the dining attendants had served in large plates, but only a few spoonfuls, and then she let it stand. Pretty Marussia kept pressing her little handkerchief, fragrant with orange perfume, to her mouth to stifle her giggles. Miss Robinson was reading the same letter, in the same rounded hand that she had been reading that morning. Apparently she could not speak a word of German, and did not wish to. Joachim struck a chivalrous pose, and said something to her in English about the weather, to which, while still chewing, she gave a monosyllabic reply, and then fell silent again. As for Frau Steur, in her Scotch-plaid woolen blouse, she had had her check-up that morning, and reported about it in her affected, uneducated way, drawing her upper lip back from her rabbit-like teeth. She complained of a rattle on the upper right side, and her breathing was reduced just under her left shoulder blade. And the boss had told her she would have to stay another 5 months. In her unlettered fashion, she called Director Behrens the boss. Moreover, she declared her outrage that the boss was not sitting at their table again today. The retardation schedule, she apparently meant rotation, demanded that the boss should be sitting at their table for dinner today, whereas the boss was once again sitting at the table on their left. And indeed, there sat Director Behrens, his gigantic hands folded in front of his plate. Though, to be sure, that was also where fat Frau Salomon from Amsterdam was seated, and she came to dinner every day of the week in a low-cut dress, apparently quite to the boss's liking, although she, Frau Steur, could not understand it, because, after all, he could see however much of Frau Salomon he wanted at every checkup. A little later she told them, in an excited whisper, that yesterday evening the lights had been turned out in the upper common lounging area, the one on the roof, for purposes that Frau Steur described as transparent. The boss had noticed it, and gone into such a rage that you could hear him all over the building. But of course, once again, he had not located the guilty party, although one didn't have to have a university degree to guess that, of course, it had been Captain Miklosic from Bucharest, for whom it could never be dark enough when he was in the company of ladies. A man lacking in every refinement, although he did wear a corset, and who was no better than a beast of prey. Yes, a beast of prey, Frau Steur repeated in a smothered whisper, as beads of sweat appeared on her brow and upper lip. Why, Olive Dorf and Platz, too, knew the nature of his relationship with Frau Wurmbrand from Vienna, the general consul's wife. It wasn't enough that the captain frequently paid morning visits to Frau Wurmbrand in her room, with her still lying in bed, and stayed there the whole time she dressed. But last Tuesday, he had not left Wurmbrand's room until 4 o'clock the next morning. The nurse looking after Franz in room 19, the boy whose recent pneumothorax operation had turned out so badly, had run into him in the hall and had been so embarrassed that she got her doors mixed up and found herself in the room of Prosecutor Paravan from Dortmund. And finally, Frau Stör held forth at length about a cosmological salon down in town where she bought her mouthwash. Joachim stared down at his plate. The dinner was as splendidly prepared as it was lavish. Including the nourishing soup, it consisted of no fewer than 6 courses. The fish was followed by a superb roast with vegetables, which was followed by a salad, then roast fowl, a dumpling dessert in no way inferior to the one Hans had eaten the night before, and finally, cheese and fruit. Each item was offered twice, and not without good effect. People filled their plates at all 7 tables. They ate with the appetites of lions here in these vaulted spaces. Theirs was a hot hunger that it would have been a joy to observe if its effect had not at the same time seemed somehow eerie, even repulsive. Not only the more lively among them displayed such hunger as they chatted and pelted one another with little pills of bread. No, but also the silent, gloomy ones who, between courses, would put their heads in their hands and stare into space. At the next table on their left, an adolescent boy, still of school age to judge by his appearance, whose coat sleeves were too short, and who wore thick circular glasses. He chopped up everything heaped on his plate until it was a pasty hodgepodge, then bent over and wolfed it down, now and then pushing his napkin up behind his glasses to dry his eyes. It was unclear whether this was to wipe away sweat or tears. During this major meal of the day, 2 incidents occurred to attract Hans Castorp's attention, insofar as his condition allowed. First, the glass door slammed shut again, just as the fish course was being served. Hans Castorp flinched in irritation and told himself indignantly that this time he really must find out who the culprit was. He didn't merely think it. He was so in earnest that he spoke it out loud. "I have to know," he whispered with exaggerated fervor, so that both Miss Robinson and the teacher glanced at him in amazement. And turning his whole upper body to the left, he opened his bloodshot eyes wide. It was a lady who crossed the hall now, a young woman, a girl, really, of only average height, in a white sweater and brightly colored skirt, with reddish blonde hair, which she wore in a simple braid wound up on her head. Hans Castorp saw only a little of her profile, almost nothing, in fact. In quite marvelous contrast to her noisy entrance, she walked soundlessly, with a peculiar slinking gait, her head thrust slightly forward, and proceeded to the farthest table on the left, set perpendicular to the veranda doors, the good Russian table. As she walked, she kept one hand in the pocket of her close-fitting wool jacket, while the other was busy at the back of her head, tucking and arranging her hair. Hans Castorp looked at that hand. He had a good eye and a fine critical sense for hands, and it was always his habit first to direct his gaze at them whenever he made a new acquaintance. The hand tucking up her hair was not particularly ladylike, nor refined or well cared for, not in the way the ladies in young Hans Castorp's social circle cared for theirs. It was rather broad, with stubby fingers. There was something primitive and childish about it, rather like the hand of a schoolgirl. Her nails had clearly never seen a manicure, and had been trimmed carelessly, again like a schoolgirl's, and the cuticles had a jagged look, almost as if she were guilty of the minor vice of nail-chewing. Hans Castorp only surmised all this, however, more than he actually saw it. She was really too far away. Her table-mates greeted the latecomer with nods. As she took her seat on the near side of the table, her back to the room and right beside Dr. Krakowski, who was presiding. She turned, her hand still at her hair, and looked over her shoulder at the assembly. And Hans Castorp caught a fleeting glance of her broad cheekbones and narrow eyes, and at the sight, a vague memory of something or somebody brushed over him. But of course, a female, Hans Castorp thought, and again muttered it so emphatically to himself that the teacher, Fräulein Engelhardt, understood what he had said. The shriveled old maid smiled in sympathy. "That is Madame Chauchat," she said. "She's so careless. A charming lady." And Fräulein Engelhardt's fuzzy cheeks turned a shade rosier, which was the case, actually, whenever she opened her mouth. "French?" Hans Castorp asked sternly. "No, she's Russian," said the teacher. "Perhaps her husband is French, or of French extraction. I can't say for sure." Still incensed, Hans Castorp asked if that was her husband there, and pointed to a gentleman with hunched shoulders sitting at the good Russian table. "Oh, no, that isn't he," the teacher responded. "He's never been here even once. He's quite unknown to us." "She should learn to close a door properly," Hans Castorp said. "She always lets it slam. It's really very impolite." But since the teacher meekly accepted his rebuke as if she were the guilty party, nothing more was said about Madame Chauchat. The second incident consisted of Dr. Blumenkohl's leaving the room. It was no more than that. Suddenly, the slightly disgusted look on his face heightened, and he gazed even more worriedly at some particular point in space. Then he slid his chair back in one decisive motion and left the room. At this juncture, however, Frau Stöhr displayed her poor upbringing in the most garish light, because, apparently out of some crude satisfaction that she was less ill than Blumenkohl, she accompanied his departure with a few half-sympathetic, half-contemptuous remarks. "The poor man," she said, "he's on his last legs. He's off to have a talk with his Blue Henry again." With a stubborn, obtuse look on her face, she uttered the grotesque term, Blue Henry, without the least hesitancy, and Hans Castorp felt an urge both to laugh and to shudder as she said it. Dr. Blumenkohl, by the way, returned after a few minutes, carrying himself in the same diffident fashion as when he left, took his seat again, and went on eating. He, too, ate a great deal, and with a worried, self-absorbed look on his face, mutely took a second helping from each course. Then dinner was over. But thanks to the capable service, and their dwarf in particular, was marvelously fleet of foot, it had lasted only a little more than an hour. Breathing heavily, and not rightly knowing how he had got there, Hans Castorp found himself lying in the splendid lounge chair on his balcony, because there was a rest cure between dinner and tea, the most important of the day, in fact, and rigorously enforced. He lay there between the opaque glass walls that separated him from Joachim on one side and the Russian couple on the other. His heart pounded as he dozed, and he drew air in through his mouth. When he used his handkerchief, he found red traces of blood, but he did not have the energy to think much about it, although he was easily inclined to worry about himself, and tended by nature to play the hypochondriac. He had lit another Maria Mancini, and smoked it to the end this time, despite the taste. Feeling dizzy, anxious, and dreamy, he thought how very strangely things were going for him up here. 2 or 3 times he felt his chest shaken by suppressed laughter at the gruesome term that Frau Stöhr had used in her ignorance.